An unexpected consequence of the pandemic, it's put the Postal Service really on the front line of the 2020 election, and the United States Postal Service is quickly running out of money. It's warning states that deadlines could be too tight to process the influx of mail-in ballots by Election Day. The newly appointed Postmaster General, who is among the top Republican donors, has been making cuts since he took over the position. And today, the president walked back his comments that he would reject billions of dollars in funding for the Postal Service in the next relief bill because he specifically wanted to limit widespread mail-in voting. The president claimed vote by mail leads to fraud. There is not evidence of that, but he has not offered any more specifics. His comments had many, including Dr. Bernice King, raising the alarm about voter suppression.
We need to do what's in the safe interest of all Americans. And not suppress the vote. I mean, this is clearly voter suppression. And if I had anything to say, instead of voter suppression in this hour, we need ego suppression.
The president now says he is willing to sign off on money for the Postal Service as long as Democrats give him a trimmed-down relief bill. And in a rare show of bipartisanship, both Democrats and Republicans are promising to work together to protect the United States Postal Service. Now, the president and his wife have both requested absentee ballots in Florida that would be delivered through the Postal Service. When he was asked about it, his deputy press secretary stated the president supports absentee voting, but not universal mail-in voting. With the Senate in recess, any new coronavirus relief money would not be approved for at least another month. We'd love to know what your experiences have been with the U.S. Postal Service lately, as cuts have already been made. Have you seen any problems with your mail? What's your experience been? You can text us directly at the number you see on your screen, 404-885-7600.